Here is something no one taught you in school. Before 1900, the buildings we call hospitals looked nothing like what we have today. Nothing at all. They were architectural monuments, towering, decorative, acoustically engineered spaces, with high vaulted ceilings, expensive courtyards, and bell systems so large their sound could be heard for miles. And then, within a single generation, nearly every single one of them disappeared. Not renovated, not repurposed, gone. Demolished, replaced, erased, quietly, systematically, and almost universally across dozens of countries at the same time. The official explanation calls this progress. But the deeper I looked, the more that explanation started to collapse. Let's begin with what we're told. We're told that pre-1900 hospitals were primitive, even dangerous, infection-ridden charity wards where the poor went to die. We're told that as medicine advanced, these old buildings were naturally replaced, superseded by the gleaming scientific institutions of the 20th century. Progress. Evolution. The march of rational thought displacing superstition. That's the story. But here is the first anomaly. If these were simply inferior buildings, the transition would have been gradual, regional, uneven. Some cities holding on longer, some adapting, some repurposing. You would expect something to survive. Almost nothing did. And what does survive suggests these old buildings were far more advanced and far from infection-ridden. Take the Hôtel-Dieu in Paris, founded, according to official records, in the 7th century. The version standing in the 19th century was a vast, cathedral-like complex on the Isle de la Cité. Arched corridors, soaring interior chambers, a bell tower integrated directly into its healing wards. It was demolished and rebuilt in 1878. The old structure. Gone. The old Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, Bedlam, they called it. A building so architecturally ambitious that visitors came from across Europe simply to walk its halls. It was moved, rebuilt, the original structure repurposed for something else entirely. The Royal Edinburgh Asylum. The Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Groote Schuur in Cape Town. The São João Hospital in Porto. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every continent where Western infrastructure had taken hold by the mid-1800s. These were not small clinics. They were not modest stone buildings. They were massive, ornate, over-engineered for what we're told they were used for. And here is the strangest part. They were all equipped with bells. Large bells, sometimes multiple bells. Bell towers built directly into the medical complex itself, not into an adjoining chapel, not into a nearby administrative building, but into the healing wards. This raises a simple but critical question. Why would a building designed purely for the containment and treatment of the sick need, architecturally, a resonant bell system integrated into its healing spaces? No one seems to ask this question. I started asking it. The official explanation is that these were simply timekeeping mechanisms, shift changes, meal schedules, administrative signals. That explanation held for me until I found a particular reference in an 1847 hospital administrator's journal from a facility in Edinburgh. A facility that was demolished in 1902, its records scattered across 3 archives, none of which have been digitized. A researcher I corresponded with had spent months physically reviewing those documents. The journal entry in question described the bell-ringing schedule in a way that didn't match any shift change or administrative function. The bells were rung, according to this administrator, for the patients. Specifically, for patients with certain conditions, what we might today call neurological complaints, chronic pain conditions, what that era called nervous disorders. The bells were rung near these patients at specific times, in specific patterns. And the administrator noted, matter-of-factly, that this practice had produced results that the newer chemical treatments had not. He wasn't theorizing. He was comparing. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were those bells doing? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In an 1863 institutional record from a hospital in Vienna, a building demolished in 1911, there are references to tonal treatments. In a Portuguese colonial hospital in Macau, demolished in 1904, local records preserved by a Catholic missionary organization describe large resonating vessels used in the treatment of fever and what the records call disorders of the vital energy. In a charitable hospital in New Orleans, consumed by fire in 1887 under circumstances never fully investigated, a former patient's memoir describes waking each morning to the sound of bells and noting that her recovery from a condition her physician had called incurable seemed to accelerate with each passing day in that ward. Anecdotes. Individual accounts. Not data. But here's the strangest part. When I started looking for the bells themselves, the physical objects, I ran into a wall. Not a shortage of information. A wall. The bells from pre-1900 hospitals are almost uniformly unaccounted for. In many cases, the demolition records note the bells were removed and sold. Sold to whom? No further documentation. In other cases, and this is where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore, the bells are documented as having been melted down. In waves. Coordinated, almost choreographed waves. The first wave came with the demolitions themselves. When the hospitals came down, the bells came down with them. Some were relocated. Most were melted. A few were preserved in museums, stripped of their original context, labeled simply as church bells or civic bells with no explanation of where they had hung or what function they had served. The second wave came during the World Wars. Both of them. In World War I, across Britain, France, Belgium, the United States, and beyond, citizens were encouraged, sometimes legally compelled, to surrender metal objects to the war effort. Bells were specifically targeted. Thousands of large, resonant, low-frequency bells were collected and melted down for munitions and industrial material. The official record frames this as a resource issue, a metal shortage, a wartime necessity. But consider the timing. By the 1910s, most pre-1900 medical institutions had already been demolished or comprehensively rebuilt. Their bells were already gone or already removed. The bells being collected in wartime scrap drives were largely the surviving ones, the bells still hanging in municipal towers, in civic buildings, in the shells of institutions that had once used them for purposes beyond simple timekeeping. The evidence suggests something much larger was being quietly concluded. And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Researchers studying frequency medicine, acoustic therapy, and what some have called resonance healing have noted repeatedly that the tonal range of pre-industrial large bells corresponds almost precisely to frequencies now studied in experimental sound therapy. Low, sustained, harmonically complex tones in the range of 40 to 200 hertz. Frequencies that appears, to have measurable effects on human biology. Some researchers argue these are the same frequencies that the body uses in cellular repair. I am not a scientist. I am not making a medical claim. I am simply asking, what do we actually know about why these bells were where they were? And why does the answer, every single time, appear to be, we don't ask that question? Here is what the official history of medicine tells us. The late 19th century was a period of rapid scientific advancement. Germ theory, developed by Pasteur and Koch, finally gave medicine a rational foundation. The old hospitals, inefficient, poorly ventilated, architecturally impractical, were replaced with modern facilities built around clinical logic. This is the official history, and it is largely accurate as far as it goes, the Flexner Report of 1910 in the United States being perhaps the most documented example. Abraham Flexner, a researcher with no medical degree, toured American medical schools and produced a report that effectively condemned the majority of existing medical education as inadequate. The result was the closure of more than half of American medical schools within a decade. Not some. Not a few. More than half. The schools that survived were those aligned with what we now call the pharmaceutical industrial model, treatment through chemical intervention, diagnosis through measurable biological markers, standardized protocols, institutional licensing. The schools that closed were disproportionately those teaching botanical medicine, homeopathy, hydrotherapy, and electrotherapy. And here is something that doesn't make the textbooks. Many of the healing traditions displaced in this period had one thing in common, and it has nothing to do with their efficacy and everything to do with their economics. They were difficult to monopolize. A botanical remedy grown in a garden. A water treatment administered in a bath. A frequency applied through a resonating instrument. These are not products you can patent. This raises a question I keep returning to. Was the displacement of these practices primarily a scientific revolution, or was it an economic one wearing a scientific mask? I'm not answering that. I'm asking it. Let me describe the coordination problem plainly, because I think it deserves to stand on its own. For the simultaneous demolition and replacement of pre-1900 healing institutions worldwide to be explained by organic historical progress, you would need several things to be true at the same time. You would need physicians in Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, New York, Buenos Aires, Sydney, and Bombay to all independently reach the same conclusions about the inadequacy of their existing institutions at roughly the same time. You would need local governments across competing political systems, constitutional monarchies, republics, colonies, emerging democracies, to all independently allocate resources for replacement on the same schedule. You would need the architectural features of the old buildings, the ceiling heights, the acoustic properties, the bell systems, to be independently judged irrelevant and unworthy of preservation across all these contexts. And you would need all of this to happen without leaving a coordinating document. Without a central body. Without a conference, a manifesto, a recorded agreement. The official history says yes. All of that happened independently because the ideas were simply correct, and correct ideas spread. The evidence suggests something much larger may have been at work, because the ideas didn't just spread. They spread with funding. In America, the institutions that funded the new medical schools, and there were specific, identifiable foundations, some of which exist to this day, were also funding the publication of the Flexner Report, the lobbying for medical licensing laws, and the early pharmaceutical companies that would supply the newly standardized treatment protocols. This is documented. This is not speculation. What is speculation, and I want to be clear about that, is the question of whether this coordination extended backward to the demolition of the buildings that had preceded the new institutions, whether the removal of the bells was intentional, whether whatever those bells may have represented was understood by someone, somewhere, to be worth eliminating before the new system could be fully established. I can't prove that. But I can point to the pattern. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every continent, within the same narrow window of time, targeting the same types of structures, the same types of practitioners, the same types of instruments. That is not an accident. Accidents don't have that kind of symmetry. Let us be specific about what emerged from the ruins of the old system. The new hospitals built from roughly 1890 onward were architecturally and philosophically different in one decisive way. They were not designed around the patient's environment. They were designed around the administration of substances. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think we have become so accustomed to this model that we have stopped seeing how strange it is. The pre-industrial hospital was, in many documented cases, an environmental machine. A building designed to produce specific conditions, light, airflow, acoustic resonance, spatial proportion, that were understood to support recovery. The patient moved through the building. The building worked on the patient. The treatment was, in a meaningful sense, architectural. The post-1900 hospital is a delivery mechanism. A controlled environment designed to administer specific substances, pharmaceutical compounds, to specific bodies at specific intervals. The building is neutral. The drug is active. This is not a subtle philosophical difference. It is a complete inversion of the therapeutic model. And here is the strangest part. The substances introduced through this new system were not all what they claimed to be. Heroin, notorious for its addictive properties, was marketed by Bayer legally as a cough suppressant for pediatric patients from 1898 into the early 20th century. This is not contested history. It is documented. Cocaine, a now controlled stimulant, was widely prescribed and commercially distributed in medical contexts throughout the transition period. Radium compounds were sold to the public as health tonics into the 1930s with institutional endorsement. Tobacco was recommended by physicians as a treatment for respiratory conditions. Lobotomies were awarded a Nobel Prize. The evidence suggests something much larger than individual errors in medical judgment. What was built was a system. A system designed not around the recovery of the patient as its primary output, but around the administration of regulated, commercially produced, institutionally endorsed substances as its primary mechanism. And because the system was global, because the coordination had happened, there was, by the early 20th century, no alternative infrastructure to turn to. The old buildings were gone. The old practices had no institutional home. The knowledge was scattered, undocumented, held only by individuals who had no professional standing in the new order. This raises a question I cannot answer but cannot stop asking. Was this the point? And now we arrive at the territory that most researchers avoid. The territory where the evidence becomes harder to verify, where the claims become more contested, where the official response shifts from dismissal to something that feels, in its uniformity, almost like discomfort. Tartaria. I am not going to tell you that Tartaria was a specific civilization with a capital city and a flag. I am not going to make that claim. What I am going to do is ask you to consider a set of observations that have accumulated not from fringe sources, but from architectural historians, from comparative archaeologists, from researchers working at the edges of what is academically permissible, and to ask yourself whether those observations, taken together, suggest something that the official history of the 19th century has not fully explained. There are buildings standing today in cities across Europe, North America, and beyond that appear architecturally to be older than their documented construction dates. Buildings with acoustic properties that exceed any practical explanation under the stated use case. Buildings with sub-basement levels that are documented in original blueprints but described in city records as having been filled in during infrastructure upgrades of the early 20th century. Buildings that appear in the earliest available photographs already aged, already worn, in ways inconsistent with their supposedly recent construction. The hospitals of the pre-1900 era fit this pattern. The deeper I went into the architectural records of demolished 19th-century medical institutions, the more frequently I encountered what can only be described as a documentation problem. Buildings for which we have operating records, patient intakes, staff rosters, supply invoices, but no construction records, no founding documents, no architectural plans. Buildings that simply appear in city records fully operational without a documented moment of having been built. What does this mean? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I know that the buildings torn down in the 1880 to 1910 window were, in many cases, not merely old. They were anomalously old. And they were equipped with systems, acoustic systems, resonant bell networks, architectural features designed to manipulate sound and frequency in enclosed spaces, that appear in no medical textbook from any period, that appear in no formal medical tradition I have been able to identify. Which raises the possibility, not the certainty, not the proof, but the genuine, uncomfortable possibility, that these buildings were not built by the civilization that demolished them. That they were inherited. And that what was erased in the demolition wave of the late 19th century was not merely an older style of medical architecture, but the last physical remnants of a prior technical and philosophical tradition that understood something about the relationship between frequency, resonance, the built environment, and human health that we do not understand today. That we have not been given the tools to understand. That the system built to replace it was built, in part, to ensure we would not go looking. The silence was deafening. I want to leave you with a few questions. Not answers. Questions. Why did the architectural transition of the world's medical infrastructure happen without a documented debate? Why does the record simply stop and start again differently, with no apparent argument separating the two traditions? Why were the bells specifically targeted? Why is the frequency range of pre-industrial large bells so consistently aligned with the ranges now being studied in acoustic medicine? And why does the mainstream history of medicine show almost no curiosity about this alignment? Why does the same demolition window, 1880 to 1910, appear on every continent, in every political system, in every language, simultaneously? Who had the reach to make that happen? And why has no historian made this coordination the subject of a comprehensive study? Why were so many of these buildings without construction records? Why do the earliest photographs so often show them already worn, already settled into the earth, already ancient in ways their official dates cannot account for? And why, when you begin pulling on any one of these threads, do you find yourself arriving at the same moment, the same 30-year window, the same quiet, coordinated, globally synchronized erasure, over and over again? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The old hospitals are gone. The bells are melted. The practices they housed are undocumented. The knowledge they embodied, if it existed, if it was real, if it was something more than we have been told, is scattered, dispersed, held in fragments by researchers working in isolation, finding each other slowly, asking the same questions. Not what was lost. Not when. Not even how. But why someone needed it gone.